In this movie, we're going to discuss how to control our content size as well as deal with overflow. So we're starting to look at the different properties available to us through our box model with controlling our content size. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might have picked up that we can control our size by defining our width and height properties. In our example, our width and heights are being defined by percentages. However, we can use any of the absolute or relative measurement systems that we want. Now, when we are setting up our content size, we're just setting up the size allotted to the content. It is not going to include anything that will be defined for our padding, borders, or margins. So we're going to need to include the padding, the borders, and the margins, as well as our content size for the true size of our objects in our designs. For example, say that we have 300 pixels of space available to us, and we want to put in some content as well as set up our padding, borders, and margins. So if we know that we're going to have a border set to 2 pixels, then we have to account for 2 pixels on each side. So there we have 4 pixels. And if we know that we want a margin of 10 pixels, then we have 10 pixels on both the left and right hand side, as well as 10 pixels on the top and the bottom. But to calculate the width here, we just need to pay attention to the left and right hand side. So then at that point we've taken up 24 pixels of space, and then let's say that we want 5 pixels of padding on the inside. That's another 10, which means that we've taken up 34 pixels just by our padding, borders, and margins alone. So if we have that 300 pixels of space, we now are going to be left with 266 pixels of space. So whenever we're setting up our content regions, we need to make sure that we take our padding and borders and margins into consideration for the entire overall design. Now, in addition to our traditional measurements with our relative and absolute measurement systems, we also have some flexibility with a couple of additional properties that we can use instead of our width and height. And those are the min and max versions of our height and width. Now, our min versions are going to specify the minimum height or width that our design will scale down to, at which point it will stop scaling and you're not going to be able to resize our content any further. On the flip side, we have the max versions of our height and width that will specify how large our design will scale out to. So if our overall purpose is to make sure that our designs are as flexible as possible, we may want to end up implementing our min and max height and width. Now, when we set up our content region size, such as what we have here with our paragraph, with our width being 60% and our height being 30%, we may end up having something that happens where our content is actually much larger than the area that we have designated. If that happens, we need to take control of that situation with our overflow property. Now, essentially, what the overflow property will do is it will control what happens to the content when it is larger than a defined content region. So here we have a overflow property being applied to our paragraph tags, and we have 4 different options. We have hidden, visible, scroll, and auto. First, we have hidden. If we have our overflow property set to hidden, it's going to hide that content. So what will happen is the content is just going to get cut off or clipped to the height of that specific object. So basically, nobody's going to be able to read the content that's in that box. Sometimes that's a good thing, but other times it's not such a good thing. The second option we have is visible, and that's going to make it so that our content will still be visible on the screen. Now, in fact, this is the default for a lot of our different browsers. Some browsers will just have our content flowing outside of the box that's been defined, and it's very easy to see that this is happening, especially if you have a border or a background color set. Other browsers will actually cause that content region to resize according to the size of the actual content. The third option that we have is scroll. And the scroll option is going to make it so that we will always have scroll bars on our content regardless of whether we need it or not. The last option is kind of like scroll, except it's only going to gain scroll bars when the content is larger than the designated size. So typically, if you are aware that there's possibility that the text will overflow beyond the size of the box that you've set up, you will additionally want to use the overflow property set to auto. Now, this is going to be pretty commonplace whenever you're using some of your different layouts, especially your absolute positioning, and anytime that you specify both the width and the height of your content regions. Now, that concludes this look at our size and overflow options.